A fugitive, sentenced to 100 years in prison, appears lying in a millionaire's bed on a rainy night the next day. 100 police cars show up in front of his mansion, and he discovers she was convicted of committing a terrible crime rate. My story from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The rain hammered against the mansion windows like stray bullets in the darkness. 30-year-old millionaire Jason shoved the front door open with his shoulder, his soaked clothes clinging to his muscular body as he dragged his travel bag across the polished marble of the hall. The business trip had stretched into 3 exhausting days, closing deals that would move millions within his construction company. But all he wanted now was the silence of his bedroom and a good night's sleep. Footsteps echoed through the empty house as he ascended the mahogany staircase, each step creaking under his weight. The housekeeper had taken the week off, leaving the property immersed in an almost sepulchral quiet. Lightning flashed across the night sky, casting dancing shadows on the walls decorated with works of art that cost more than many people would earn in a lifetime. Pushing open the door to the master bedroom, his heart nearly stopped. A figure was lying in his bed, huddled under the Italian silk sheets. The woman was visibly shivering, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Her soaked clothes formed a puddle on the Persian rug, and drops of water dripped from her pale fingers. For a moment, he considered calling the private security that patrolled the upscale neighborhood, but something in her posture made him hesitate. There was no aggression in her presence, only a desperation that seemed to emanate from every pore of her skin. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing penetrating irises that shone like stars amidst the storm. "Please." Her voice came out as a raspy whisper, filled with a pain he couldn't comprehend. "I just need one night, just until dawn, I promise." He should have felt invaded, violated in his own home, but the vulnerability in those eyes completely disarmed his defenses. There was something genuine in her desperation, a fragility that contrasted with the iron determination he recognized in himself. Without a word, he walked to the closet and pulled out one of his Egyptian cotton shirts and a robe. "Put this on," he murmured, extending the dry clothes. "You'll end up getting sick." She accepted the clothes with trembling hands, her fingers briefly brushing against his. The touch sent an electric current through his arm, a sensation he hadn't felt in years of empty relationships with women of his social class. He turned his back as she changed, listening to the soft sound of the wet fabric being removed. "Thank you," she said, and he could hear the tears in her voice. "I know this is strange, invasive, but I had nowhere else to go." When he turned around again, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, lost inside his large clothes. The contrast was touching. A woman clearly accustomed to fighting for survival, temporarily enveloped in the luxury he considered natural. Her eyes scanned the opulent room, absorbing every detail as if she were memorizing a dream that would soon disappear. "What happened?" he asked, sitting in the leather armchair by the window. "Why are you running?" She lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously playing with the hem of the shirt. "There are people who want to hurt me. Powerful people who made up lies about me, who blamed me for something terrible I would never do." Her voice broke slightly. "I used to work taking care of kids, you know. It was all I knew how to do, all I loved. And now they believe I'm a monster." The millionaire leaned forward, studying every micro-expression on her face. He had learned to read people during years of ruthless negotiations, and every instinct told him that she was telling the truth. There was a purity in her pain that couldn't be faked, an innocence that had survived despite whatever she had faced. "How did you get in here?" he questioned, more out of curiosity than accusation. A melancholic smile curved her lips. "The back door was unlocked. I saw the lights were off, and I thought the house was empty." "Sorry, I would never do this under normal circumstances, but the rain was so heavy, and I couldn't find any place to take shelter." Lightning continued to illuminate the sky, and the sound of the storm created an intimate atmosphere that seemed to suspend time. They talked in whispers until the early hours of the morning, she telling fragments of her life, the orphanage where she had worked, the children she loved as daughters, the injustice that had forced her to flee. He spoke about the loneliness that wealth and success couldn't fill, about how he had built an empire but lost his soul in the process. When exhaustion finally overcame them, she settled on the couch in the suite while he remained in the bed, both respecting a physical distance that couldn't diminish the growing emotional connection between them. He fell asleep, listening to her soft breathing, a comforting melody that calmed his restless mind in a way that no sleeping pill ever could. Upon awakening with the first rays of sun, he found only the note on the pillow where she had slept. The words were simple, written in delicate handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that there is still goodness in the world. I will never forget your kindness." The shirt he had lent her was folded perfectly on the armchair, along with the robe, both carrying the subtle scent of her skin. He ran to the window, hoping to glimpse her walking down the street, but she had disappeared like a mirage. The garden, wet from the previous night's rain, was the only evidence that the storm had really happened. For a moment, he questioned if it had all been a vivid dream, a product of his exhaustion. An hour later, the sound of sirens cut through the morning silence. Police cars approached at high speed, their red and blue lights painting the white walls of the mansion with nightmare colors. The detective knocked on the door with unnecessary force, as if trying to break down the solid wood with his fists. When the millionaire opened it, he found a middle-aged man with cold eyes and an expression that mixed authority with barely disguised contempt. Behind him, a crowd of police officers spread across the perfectly manicured garden, their boots trampling the flowers that cost a fortune to import. "We need to search your property," the detective declared without preamble, displaying a search warrant. "We have reason to believe that you are harboring a dangerous criminal." The words hit the millionaire like punches to the stomach. "A criminal? What are you talking about?" "The woman who was here last night. We have evidence that she spent the night in your house." The detective entered without waiting for permission, his eyes scanning the luxurious hall with a mixture of envy and repulsion. "She is a fugitive convicted of arson. 100 years in prison for killing dozens of innocent children in an orphanage." The world seemed to collapse around him. The woman who had touched his heart with such purity, who had spoken so lovingly about the children she cared for, was a murderer. The contradiction was so absurd that he almost laughed, but the seriousness on the faces of the police officers stopped him. "That's impossible," he murmured, more to himself than to the detective. "She told me about the orphanage, about how she loved those children." "Of course she did. Psychopaths are masters of manipulation." The detective nodded to his subordinates, who began to spread through the house like ants. "She probably used that story to gain your sympathy. How many rich, lonely men do you think she has tricked like this?" Each word was a blade, cutting his certainties. For hours, the police officers ransacked every room, every drawer, looking for evidence that he was collaborating with a fugitive. They found the still damp sheets where she had slept, fibers of her hair on the fabric, footprints on the carpet. Enough evidence to confirm that she had really been there. When they finally left, taking with them samples and photographs, the millionaire was alone in his violated home. The news didn't take long to arrive. Within hours, reporters were crowding at the gates of his property, cameras capturing every movement. The headlines were cruel. "Millionaire shelters child killer, builder harboring convicted fugitive." His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Nervous partners wanted explanations. Contracts were being cancelled. Emergency meetings were being called. His company, built over a decade of tireless work, teetered on the tightrope of public opinion. Investors began to back away like rats abandoning a sinking ship. But he couldn't get the woman's desperate eyes out of his mind, the sincerity in her voice when she spoke about the children. There was something deeply wrong with that story. a dissonance that his analytical mind refused to ignore. Against all the advice of his lawyers, he decided to hire private investigators to uncover the truth. The private detective's office was located in a less affluent area of the city, between small shops and commercial buildings worn down by time. The man was a former police officer in his 50s, with scars that told stories of a dangerous career. His fees were high, but the millionaire was willing to spend every penny of his fortune if necessary. "You want me to prove the innocence of a woman convicted of killing children?" asked the investigator, flipping through the case documents. "Do you have any idea how that sounds?" "I know it sounds crazy," admitted the millionaire, "but something doesn't fit. The woman I met isn't capable of hurting a fly, let alone children." The next days turned into an emotional roller coaster. While his reputation crumbled publicly, he obsessively delved into the details of the case. The fire had happened 2 years before, in an orphanage on the outskirts of town. 43 children had perished in the flames, along with 6 employees. The mysterious woman was the only survivor of the night shift, found unconscious outside the building. The evidence against her seemed overwhelming at first glance. Traces of fuel on her clothes, her history of financial problems, witnesses who swore they had seen her arguing with the director of the orphanage days before the tragedy. The trial had been quick and efficient, the conviction almost unanimous. But as the investigator delved deeper into the case, disturbing inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses who changed their testimonies between the initial interrogations and the trial. Physical evidence that mysteriously disappeared from the files. A security system that coincidentally had malfunctioned on the night of the fire. The millionaire felt torn between reason and heart. Each piece of evidence that questioned her guilt reassured him, but also terrified him. What if she was really guilty? What if he was being manipulated by a skilled sociopath? The uncertainty corroded his soul like acid. 2 weeks after her escape, the investigator brought the first significant discovery. The director of the orphanage, who died in the fire, had been under federal investigation for embezzlement. Millions earmarked for the maintenance of the building had disappeared, leaving the electrical installations in a precarious state. The report was buried in bureaucratic files, ignored during the trial. "Why wasn't this information presented in her defense?" questioned the millionaire, studying the documents with trembling hands. "Good question. Her lawyer was a public defender, overworked, barely had time to read the case properly." The investigator lit a cigarette, ignoring the protests about smoking in the elegant office. "But that doesn't explain why the prosecutor also ignored this evidence. Unless what? Unless someone really wanted her to be convicted. Someone with enough power to influence investigators, prosecutors, judges. The idea of a conspiracy seemed absurd, but the evidence was beginning to form a disturbing pattern. The millionaire authorized the investigator to expand the search, hiring a full team of forensic experts. His fortune was dwindling rapidly, but he didn't care. He had found a purpose that transcended profits and dividends. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city, she survived as she could. She worked in night establishments as a cleaner, always with her head down, always looking over her shoulder. Fear was her constant companion, whispering in her ears that at any moment she could be recognized and captured. But in the lonely hours before dawn, when the city finally fell asleep, she allowed herself to remember the night in the mansion, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the feeling of security she hadn't felt in years. He probably hated her now, after finding out who she supposedly was. The idea cut her heart like shattered glass, but she couldn't blame him. Who would believe in the innocence of a woman convicted of killing children? 3 months had passed since that stormy night, and the millionaire seemed like a different man. His obsession with the truth had consumed not only his fortune, but also his appearance. The impeccable suits were replaced by simple clothes. The perfectly styled hair now grew unkempt, and deep circles marked his face. but in his eyes burned a determination that no adversity had managed to extinguish. The investigator had tracked down clues throughout the city, following a faint trail of temporary jobs and cheap apartments. Finally, on a grey autumn morning, he called with a voice tense with emotion. He had found the address where she was living. The building was in one of the most deteriorated areas of the periphery, where the smell of sewage mixed with factory smoke and the noise of traffic never ceased. The concrete walls were stained by moisture, broken windows covered with cardboard, stairs that creaked dangerously with each step. It was a brutal contrast to his mansion in the upscale neighborhood, a cruel reminder of how quickly destinies could change. He went up to the 4th floor, his heart pounding against his ribs. Apartment 402 had a peeling wooden door, multiple locks installed precariously. When he knocked, he heard hesitant footsteps approaching. Then, absolute silence. "It's me," he said softly, resting his forehead against the cold door. From the night of the storm. The sound of locks being opened echoed through the narrow hallway. When the door opened just a crack, revealing a suspicious eye, he felt the world stop. Even through that small space, he could see how she had changed. Her face thinner, her skin paler, her hair cut unevenly, as if she herself had used a blunt pair of scissors. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but she opened the door enough for him to enter. The apartment was tiny, furnished only with the essentials, a single bed, an old table, 2 rickety chairs. But it was impeccably clean, each object in its place, as if organization were her only way to maintain sanity. In the small kitchen, cheap pans shone as if they were polished silver. "I know you're innocent," he said bluntly, watching her freeze at those words. "I hired investigators. We found out about the embezzlement, about the precarious electrical installations, about how you were used as a scapegoat." She turned slowly, and he saw tears running down her cheeks. "Why would you do this? Why risk everything for a stranger?" "Because I know how to recognize the truth when I see it. And because—" He stopped, struggling against the words that wanted to escape. "Because I haven't been able to get you out of my head for a single day since you disappeared." The silence that followed was charged with an electrical tension that made the air seem dense. She approached hesitantly, like a wounded animal testing whether it was safe to trust again. When they finally came face to face, he could see every detail of her suffering, the deep circles under her eyes, the chapped lips, the hands calloused by hard work. "There's something you need to know," she murmured, lowering her eyes. "Something that will change everything." Before he could ask, she stepped away and lifted the simple blouse she was wearing. Her belly, previously flat, now displayed an unmistakable curvature. 3 months of gestation, maybe 4. His world collapsed again. All the fantasies he had built during sleepless nights, all the romantic scenarios his mind had created, shattered like glass. She was pregnant, by another man, from a life he was not part of. "He left me when he found out about the conviction," she explained in a broken voice, unable to look him in the eyes. "Said he couldn't risk his career being associated with a child killer. I found out about the pregnancy 2 weeks after I ran away." He slumped into one of the rickety chairs, trying to process the information. The pain was physical, as if someone had stuck a knife in his chest and slowly twisted it. But along with the pain came something unexpected, a fierce anger against the man who had abandoned the woman he loved at her most vulnerable moment. "Where is he now?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "I don't know. And it doesn't matter." She lowered her blouse and sat on the bed, her shoulders hunched over by the weight of her situation. He showed who he really was. "I don't blame him, actually. Who would want to get involved with someone like me?" "I would," he said without hesitation, surprising both of them with the firmness in his voice. "I would." She raised her eyes, incredulous. "You don't understand. I'm not just a fugitive. Now I'm a pregnant fugitive, without resources, without a future. And even if you prove my innocence, there will always be people who doubt, who will see me as the woman who killed children. Then we will fight them all together." The following weeks unfolded like a strange dream. The millionaire rented a better apartment for her, in a safer neighborhood, away from curious eyes and malicious tongues. Not on the same street as his mansion, that would be too risky, but close enough so that he could visit her daily. She resisted initially, too proud to accept charity. But when he explained that it wasn't charity, but an investment in the future he wanted to build with her, something in her eyes transformed. It wasn't love yet. It would take time to blossom after so much suffering. But it was the beginning of hope. The investigator continued to dig up the truth, discovering deeper and deeper layers of corruption and negligence. The director of the orphanage had not only embezzled maintenance funds, he had falsified safety reports, bribed inspectors, and created a network of complicity that extended to the highest spheres of municipal power. During this period, the intimacy between them grew gradually. He arrived every afternoon after work, what little remained of his company, bringing fresh food, prenatal vitamins, books for the long, lonely hours. They talked about everything and nothing, building a solid foundation of mutual trust. One evening, while she was arranging some papers on the table, he noticed her notebook open. The pages were covered with delicate drawings, children playing, innocent smiles, small, outstretched hands. It was her way of keeping alive the memories of the little ones she had cared for at the orphanage. "They were my family," she murmured, noticing his gaze. "Some arrived as abandoned babies, others came already scarred by life, but they all found love there. At least they used to. You will find a way to help children again," he promised. "When this is all over, when your innocence is proven, you will have the resources to create the orphanage they deserve to have." It was at that moment that the sexual tension that had been growing between them almost exploded. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. He approached slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wanted. When their hands finally touched, the electricity was instantaneous. But she pulled away at the last second, her breath ragged. "I can't," she whispered. "Not yet. There's too much at stake. Too much pain to be healed first." He nodded, respecting her boundaries, even though every fiber of his being screamed to hold her in his arms. True love, he realized, sometimes meant waiting. However, life was about to get even more complicated when the investigator arrived the next morning with a discovery that would change everything. He had found evidence that the very detective in charge of the original case was involved in the corruption scheme. The investigator spread the photographs on the table like a player revealing a royal flush. Each image told a part of the story that had been carefully concealed. The detective entering an expensive restaurant with the director of the orphanage weeks before the fire, bank statements showing mysterious deposits in his account, fraudulent contracts signed in his handwriting. "He wasn't just an accomplice," explained the investigator, lighting another cigarette. "He was a partner." The detective had a shell company that supplied construction materials for public building renovations. Inferior quality materials sold at premium prices, with the director of the orphanage receiving kickbacks for the contracts. Jason studied each document with growing indignation. His fortune had dwindled significantly over the months. His stock investments were practically wiped out. Much of his net worth had been converted into dollars to pay for the investigation, but every penny spent was justified by that irrefutable evidence. When the scheme began to be uncovered by federal auditors, they needed a scapegoat, continued the investigator. Someone to carry the blame for the fire that would inevitably happen due to negligence with electrical maintenance. "And she was perfect for it," murmured Jason, feeling bile rise in his throat. "A humble employee without the resources to defend herself properly." "Exactly. They planted evidence, bribed witnesses, destroyed documents that would prove her innocence. The judicial system worked exactly as they wanted, fast, efficient, and without questions. 2 days later, armed with this explosive evidence, Jason sought out the best criminal defense attorney in the metropolitan area. The man was known for reversing seemingly impossible convictions, but his fees were astronomical. Fortunately, there were still some assets that could be liquidated. Meanwhile, her pregnancy was progressing visibly. By the 6th month, her belly had become prominent, and the baby's movements were constant. He spent his nights sitting next to her on the couch, sometimes feeling small kicks through the stretched skin. In those intimate moments, the sexual tension between them transformed into something deeper, an emotional connection that transcended physical desire. "What are you going to name him?" he asked one night, his hand resting gently on her belly. "I still don't know. I want to meet him first, see what personality he has." She covered his hand with hers, interlacing her fingers. "But I know he will be strong. He will have to be, considering everything he's already gone through even before being born. He will have everything I can offer," he promised. "Education, opportunities, love, regardless of who the biological father is." She turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why are you doing this? Why are you willing to take responsibility for a child that isn't yours?" "Because I love his mother," he replied without hesitation. "And because every child deserves to have someone who fights for them, who protects them, who gives them hope for a better future." It was on that night that she finally allowed herself to kiss him. A sweet kiss, filled with gratitude and promises of a future that was beginning to seem possible. When they broke apart, both were crying. The process of reviewing the case began 3 weeks later. The criminal defense attorney presented the evidence meticulously, building an irrefutable argument about her innocence and the systematic corruption that had led to her conviction. The media, which had previously condemned her summarily, now turned like vultures on the true story. The corrupt detective tried to deny everything initially, but when confronted with the bank statements and photographs, his defense crumbled like a house of cards. Other police officers involved in the scheme began to make plea deals, revealing even deeper layers of corruption. During the last days of her pregnancy, she had to attend some hearings. Jason never left her side, holding her hand during the most difficult moments, providing strength when she seemed about to collapse. Seeing the real culprits being interrogated was simultaneously liberating and painful. Liberating because the truth was finally coming to light. Painful because nothing could bring back the lost children or the years of suffering she had faced. The baby was born on a spring night, 3 days before the final court sentence. It was a healthy boy with dark hair and curious eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the new world around him. Jason was present at the birth, holding her hand during the contractions, being the first to hold the baby when he finally arrived. "He's perfect," he whispered, looking at the wrinkled little face that already showed traces of determination. "Absolutely perfect." "Our son," she murmured, exhausted but radiant. "Because that's what you are now, isn't it?" "His father? If you'll let me be." The sentence came 2 days later. Total innocence, all charges dropped, substantial compensation for the years lost in prison and for the moral damages suffered. The corrupt detective and his accomplices were sentenced to decades in prison. The director of the orphanage, who died in the fire, was posthumously held responsible for the criminal negligence that had caused the tragedy. When they left the courthouse, she was officially free. Free to rebuild her life, free to love, free to raise her son without the weight of guilt that wasn't hers. The reporters crowded around them, but Jason had hired security guards to clear a path to the car. "How does it feel to be exonerated?" shouted a journalist. "Relieved," she answered simply, "but mostly sad for the children we lost. Nothing will bring them back." 6 months later, they were married in an intimate ceremony in the garden of the restored mansion. She wore a simple cream-colored dress, he a discreet suit. The baby slept in the arms of the improvised grandmother, a former employee of the orphanage, who had testified in favor of her innocence during the trial. The compensation received was fully allocated to the creation of a foundation for orphanages, ensuring that adequate facilities and rigorous supervision would prevent future tragedies. Jason contributed the remaining resources of his fortune, and together they began to build something bigger than their individual dreams. "You know we'll probably just be normal rich now, no longer millionaires," he joked during their honeymoon at a beachside inn. "Perfect," she laughed, watching her son play in the sand. "Normal rich means we have enough to be happy without having to worry if people love us for who we are or for what we have. And we have our family." "Our family," she agreed, kissing him gently. "A family built on truth, forgiveness, and the belief that love can overcome any adversity." 2 years later, the first orphanage of the foundation was inaugurated. It had modern facilities, trained staff, and rigorous security systems. At the ceremony, she held her second child, a light-eyed, mischievous, smiling girl, while the eldest son, now almost 3 years old, ran among the children who would soon call that place home. "The children we lost cannot come back," she said in her speech to the gathered crowd. "But we can honor their memory by ensuring that other children have the safety and love they deserve to have." Jason watched from the back of the auditorium, proud of the extraordinary woman who had become his wife. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her injustice into justice for others, and he had discovered that true wealth was not in assets or investments, but in the family they had built together and in the legacy of hope they would leave to the world. That night, lying in bed, she commented, "Sometimes I think about that storm that led me to your house. If it hadn't rained so hard, if I hadn't found your door open, fate would have found another way," he replied, stroking her hair. "People like us were destined to meet, like people like us, people willing to fight for the truth, even when the whole world is against them, people who believe that love can conquer any storm, and as sleep overcame them, embraced in their shared bed, the children sleeping safely in the next room, they knew that they had created something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of their individual tragedies. A family, a purpose, a proof that even in the greatest storms there is always shelter for those brave enough to seek it and generous enough to offer it. If you liked this wonderful story, please comment, giving a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important. And if you love beautiful stories, subscribe to my channel. I promise to make your day better with my videos.